Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world.
I am so glad to be here for this one.
And I am so glad you, the listener, could join us today, because we are going to embark on a really fascinating journey.
And it goes to some very unexpected
Oh,
places.
absolutely. So today's mission for this deep dive is to explore the interactive entertainment industry. But I want to set the ground rules right up front here. We are definitely not going to look at video games merely as a collection of consumer products you buy off a shelf.
Right, or as simple toys for teenagers, which is the trap most people fall into when discussing this topic.
Exactly. Or even just as an emerging form of digital art, we want to go much, much deeper than that. We are going to map out a massive, highly complex, hybrid artistic commercial system. We're looking for the invisible architecture.
The structural blueprints.
Yes, the blueprints where narrative ambition, cutting-edge technological innovation, corporate scale, player agency, and this is key, incredibly potent addictive design logics all intersect.
And they really do collide in this space. Our entry point for this systems-level institutional analysis is Tom Bissell's deeply observant book, Extra Lives: Why Video Games Matter.
And just to set the parameters for you, the listener, this is not a book review.
No, definitely not.
We aren't doing a commentary on Bissell's personal memoir elements. We're not trying to convince you to go out and buy a console. Instead, we're using his on-the-ground reporting and his critical observations as a sort of topographical map.
Right. We are using the text to look under the hood of an industry that literally shapes the attention, the psychology, and the daily habits of billions of people across the globe.
Billions. It's staggering. And to really set the stage for how overwhelmingly powerful this system is, I want to start by sharing a striking anecdote from the source material.
I love this story.
It's so good. I want you to picture the date. It's November 4, 2008.
A pretty historic day.
Very. The world is watching a profoundly historic, culture-shifting U.S. presidential election. The author of our source text happens to be living in Tallinn, Estonia at the time. He's an American, he's deeply invested in the outcome, and he has CNN International ready to go on his television, just waiting for the race to be called. He's ready to witness history.
It's the kind of moment where you remember exactly where you were.
Exactly. But earlier that same afternoon, a local game store had called him to say that a highly anticipated, massive, open-world game called Fallout 3 had finally arrived.
So he goes to get it.
He goes and picks it up, he comes back to his apartment, looks at the clock, and slips the disc into his console. And he tells himself what what almost every player has told themselves at some point.
Just 1 hour.
Just 1 hour, maybe 2. I will just check it out, and absolutely no more than 3 hours because I have to watch the election.
It is the classic negotiation. You're bargaining with the system before you even press start.
Totally. So he presses start, and 7 hours later, he emerges, blinking, dazed, and completely disoriented.
Wow.
He turns off the console, checks the news, and realizes the historic acceptance speech has already been given.
He missed it entirely.
Entirely. The crowds in Chicago have already cheered, the pundits have already broken down the maps, and he missed the whole thing. At the exact moment the political landscape of America changed forever, he was wandering an irradiated, post-apocalyptic, digital wasteland.
He was nervously monitoring his virtual radiation levels.
Yes, he was armed with a pixelated baseball bat, hunting down a gang of virtual marauders, and he was utterly, completely consumed by it.
Which really forces us to pause and ask a fundamental question about human behavior.
Why? I mean, what systems of incentive, what psychological hooks are embedded in this software that are so incredibly potent, so masterfully engineered, that they can literally eclipse historic reality?
How does a glowing box make you forget the real world entirely?
Right.
And to answer that, we really have to look past the surface-level culture war debates that usually surround this medium. You know the ones.
The endless talk show arguments.
Yeah, the debates about, are video games art? Or the moral panics of, are they just murder simulators corrupting the youth?
Which we see all the time.
Constantly.
Yeah.
But those framing devices completely fail because they only look at the content. They are arguing about the paint colors on the walls. Today, we are going to examine the underlying structural realities, the architecture of the building itself. How are these interactive systems actually designed from the ground up? How do they financially and psychologically incentivize human behavior? And why do they predictably yield very specific, highly calibrated outcomes within our modern attention economy?
Okay, let's start at the absolute foundation, because I was genuinely shocked by this when I read it. when we think about where other art forms come from, there's a logical lineage, right?
Visually, yeah.
Like literature evolved organically from oral storytelling traditions around a fire. Cinema evolved from a combination of still photography and stage theater. But video games, they have a completely different, almost startlingly clinical origin story.
They really do, and it is crucial for understanding the DNA of the entire industry today. The origins of the video game are inextricably linked to the military-industrial complex.
Which is wild.
It is. It comes from what the author calls the low-ceilinged monasteries of early computer programming. The very first video game, a 1958 program called Tennis for Two, wasn't created by a playwright or a painter. It was created by a physicist on an oscilloscope.
And not just any physicist.
No. This was a man who had literally designed the timers for the atomic bombs dropped on Japan during World War II.
I have to stop you there, because when I read that, my jaw hit the floor. The same mind that engineered the timing mechanisms for the most devastating weapon in human history built the first video game.
This is a dark and fascinating irony, but it highlights the technological environment of the time. You also look at the 1962 game Space War, which was developed at MIT.
Right.
That project was funded in part by military research and development funds funneled into university computer labs. The computers required to run these early experiments were the size of entire rooms.
And they cost millions of dollars.
Exactly. The only entities that could afford them were the military and heavily funded research universities. This DNA is vital to understand because it means game design is, at its absolute core, a software engineering culture.
That is such a massive distinction. When a novelist sits down to write a book, they usually start with an image or a character's voice or a moral theme they want to explore.
Right, a narrative impulse.
But a game designer doesn't start there, do they? Because they are operating within a complex software framework, they traditionally start by asking engineering questions. They ask, how can we make this code run faster?
Or what mathematical variables do I inject into this system to create a specific output? They start with a system which the industry calls a game mechanic.
Think about what that actually means for the creative process. It means games are essentially imagined from the outside in.
Yes, a game is first and foremost a piece of functional software. If a novel has a terrible plot and weak characters, you can still physically read the words on the page. The book still functions as a book.
You can still turn the pages.
Right. But if a video game's underlying physics engine or collision detection system doesn't work, the game literally crashes. It ceases to exist. So the people who built the foundation of this billion-dollar industry were not storytellers.
They were technical artists, programmers, engineers.
Exactly. Their primary concerns were physics, rendering speed, and memory management, not dramatic motivation, character arcs, or emotional resonance.
So if the foundation is purely mathematical and engineering-based, how does the industry actually tell a story? Because we see games today with massive, sweeping narratives.
We do.
In the source material, there is a fascinating breakdown of the structural divide in how games attempt to communicate narrative. Okay, let's unpack this. It's described as the tension between the framed narrative and the ludonarrative. Can you break those two concepts down for us?
Absolutely. It is arguably the most defining tension in the medium. The frame narrative is essentially everything the game designer explicitly dictates to you. It's the cutscenes.
The cinematic moments.
Right. The moments where the game temporarily takes your control away, changes the camera angle, and forces you to watch the characters talk or an explosion happen. The author is entirely in control of the framed narrative.
Got it. And the ludonarrative.
The ludonarrative comes from the Latin word ludus, meaning play. The ludonarrative is the unscripted, dynamic, player-controlled gameplay. It is the story of what you actually do when you have the controller in your hand and you are navigating the environment.
And what the source points out is that historically, these two systems have what the author brilliantly terms a congressional inability to work together.
They are fundamentally at odds.
The interactive entertainment industry has spent the last few decades dealing with massive Hollywood envy. They borrow heavily from cinematic language. Developers even pitch new games to major publishers using things called ripomatics,
which are literally just spliced together scenes from famous action movies to convey a mood or a vibe.
They want to be movies. But forcing static, linear, cinematic constraints onto dynamic, interactive software creates this intense, jarring friction.
It's like trying to write a sonnet while someone is constantly trying to wrestle the pen out of your hand. You have the author trying to tell a specific story, and the player trying to explore a system. Let's look at a concrete example from the text to illustrate this friction. The book spends time analyzing BioShock.
Oh, Bioshock is a perfect example. For those who aren't familiar, this is a game that is widely praised, universally acclaimed for its massive narrative and intellectual
It
ambition.
doesn't just want you to shoot things.
No, it places the player in this breathtaking, decaying 1960s underwater dystopian city called Rapture. The entire premise of the game is to explore the logical extremes and the ultimate social collapse of Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism.
The idea of unregulated self-interest and a society free from altruism or government interference.
Yes,
Yeah.
it is a brilliant, dense atmospheric setting.
It has the philosophical weight of a major dystopian novel.
Exactly. But here is where that friction between the framed narrative and the ludo-narrative tears the experience apart. Structurally, because it is built on the mechanics of a first-person shooter, how do you actually interact with this philosophical world?
Well, you spend hours upon hours scavenging through digital trash cans for ammunition.
And you shoot mutated junkies with lightning that shoots out of your hands. The game wants to talk to you about the nature of free will, but structurally it reduces the player to feeling like a rat navigating a very elaborately decorated maze.
You are being funneled down narrow, predetermined underwater hallways, specifically to trigger the next audio diary or the next cinematic event.
You are given the illusion of ultimate agency, but the system is actually rigidly, aggressively controlling your physical progression to ensure you consume the author's intended linear narrative.
And that feeling of being a rat in a maze is exactly what game developers spend millions of dollars trying to hide from you. They want to eliminate the friction. This brings up a fascinating concept within the industry known as the grammar of fun.
The grammar of fun.
Yeah, and how obsessive usability testing drives modern game design. To understand how these systems are refined, the source takes us inside a major studio called Epic Games, the creators of the massive blockbuster franchise Gears of War.
Okay.
The design process here completely shatters the myth of the solitary artistic auteur locked in a room writing a masterpiece. Game design at this scale is highly collaborative, hyper-industrialized, and deeply iterative. It relies on constant, relentless usability reports, focus groups, and rapid testing.
So what are they actually testing for? Are they testing if the story makes sense?
Rarely. They're testing to perfect that grammar of fun. The goal is to systematically eliminate any moment of frustration or confusion so that the player always knows intuitively where to go and what to do without ever feeling the artificiality of the system guiding them.
They want to keep you in a state of continuous, frictionless flow.
Exactly.
The example in the text that blew my mind regarding this grammar of fun is the roadie run feature in Gears of War. It perfectly illustrates how much invisible engineering goes into a single second of gameplay.
It really does.
So, the lead designer of the game wanted a way to simulate the frantic, terrifying feeling of moving between cover during a massive, heavy firefight. He wanted the player to feel the panic of a war zone.
Right.
So, when you press a specific button to initiate a roadie run, your massive, armored character crouches down. The in-game camera suddenly drops low to the ground, the lens goes slightly fisheyed, distorting the edges of the screen, and it starts shaking violently.
Mimicking the chaotic movement of a handheld documentary camera in a combat zone.
Yes. A miasma of digital dust and debris kicks up on the screen, obscuring your vision. It feels incredibly fast, chaotic, and panic-inducing.
It feels like you are sprinting for your life.
It totally does. But here is the brilliant trick of the system. Your character is actually barely moving any faster than their normal, casual walking speed.
It is a masterclass in psychological manipulation through sensory distortion. The system is entirely faking a sense of intense combat speed and confusion. It's an engineered illusion.
They don't actually speed you up.
No. By altering the perspective, the camera shake, and the field of view, they trick your brain into feeling adrenaline without actually speeding up the physics of the game, which would break the underlying software systems or make the character uncontrollable.
It is so clever. But it also sounds incredibly resource-intensive. I mean, getting the camera shake, the dust particles, the sound design perfectly calibrated to trick the human brain, that cannot be cheap.
It is astronomically expensive. And that realization transitions us into the second major phase of our analysis, the incentive architecture of the industry, because you cannot separate the art from the commerce in this system.
Right.
The financial scale we are talking about here is almost difficult to comprehend. We're looking at an industry where a giant established publisher like Electronic Arts can lose $750 million in a single fiscal year.
$750 million?
Yes. The budgets for these AAA console games, which is the industry term for these massive blockbuster releases, routinely hit tens of millions, sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars, and take teams of hundreds of people several years to build.
That introduces a terrifying variable into the creative process. What happens to a creative medium? What happens to the art when the cost of failure is absolute?
What's fascinating here is, in this ecosystem, if an indie film fails, the director might have a hard time getting their next project funded. But if a AAA video game fails, a single $20 or $50 million mistake can literally end the developer's career.
It can bankrupt the publisher.
It can shutter an entire studio, putting hundreds of people out of work overnight. When the financial stakes are that stratospheric, risk concentration becomes the single defining incentive of the entire system.
So let's follow that logic to its inevitable conclusion. If you are a studio executive and your entire company's survival depends on this one product selling 5 million copies, what kind of product do you greenlight?
You don't take risks.
Right. The system is heavily, overwhelmingly incentivized to rely on proven design. You do not take a $50 million gamble on a nuanced, slow-paced game about grief or subtle emotional interiority. You fund what is mathematically proven to sell.
And this is exactly the structural reason why the industry produces an endless, cyclical stream of first-person military shooters and vast, violent, open-world action games. They aren't making them just because they lack imagination or because developers are uniquely obsessed with war.
They are making them because military shooters are a known quantity. They mitigate catastrophic financial risk.
It's a survival mechanism for the corporations.
It is. And the source material gives us a terrifying glimpse into how algorithmic this survival mechanism has become. There's a section where the author takes us inside the DICE Summit.
Which stands for Design, Innovate, Communicate, Entertain.
Yes. And it's held in Las Vegas, which is incredibly fitting. This is the exclusive gathering where the true titans of the industry, the executives and lead designers all meet. And at this summit, we see presentations from massive data analytics firms, specifically a firm called EDAR.
And what EDAR does is staggering. They track 15,000 distinct variables and attributes across 8,000 different video games purely to find out what statistically correlates with high retail sales.
Think about the granularity of that data. 15,000 variables.
They aren't just tracking the genre of the game, they are tracking the minute details.
Exactly. Just imagine being in that room. They are tracking things like, is the protagonist human or alien? Is the protagonist between the ages of 18 and 34? Do they have a dog?
Is there a multiplayer mode? Does the box art feature a character holding a gun facing right or facing left?
Yes. It is the ultimate algorithmic, data-driven approach to creativity. The commercial incentive system demands what executives call believability to justify these budgets. But in this industry, the term believability has been completely co-opted.
It really has.
It is almost entirely equated with graphical photorealism.
That is a crucial point. When a game studio talks about making a believable world, they usually mean they spent $2 million ensuring the sweat on a character's brow drips realistically, or making sure the dynamic lighting reflects accurately off a puddle of water in a dark alley.
They are talking about the rendering engine.
Right. They are rarely talking about true dramatic motivation, complex emotional interiority, or believable human dialogue.
Which is why the narrative, the actual writing, the script, is so often treated as a frantic afterthought in the AAA space. The designers spend 3 years building the complex systems, the combat loops, the physics engines, the water reflections, and then 6 months before the game is supposed to ship, they realize they need a story.
They need to justify why the player is shooting thousands of digital enemies in these beautiful environments.
The source notes instances where writers were literally pushed to the absolute margins of the production pipeline, desperately writing dialogue on the exact same day the voice actors were standing in the recording booth waiting for their lines.
It's a systemic deprioritization of narrative in favor of mechanical spectacle. And what's truly fascinating is that the critical apparatus surrounding the industry, the gaming press, is caught in the exact same commercial feedback loop.
Oh, absolutely. In this ecosystem, a game reviewer functions very differently from a film critic or a literary critic. When a literary critic reviews a novel, they are evaluating its thematic depth, its prose, its cultural relevance.
But a game reviewer primarily exists to answer a consumer purchasing question. Will my $60 be well spent? Will this piece of software function correctly? And will it give me 40 hours of distraction?
They are essentially doing a product usability review disguised as art criticism. They rarely ask the deeper aesthetic or moral questions about what the game is actually saying or what worldview it promotes.
And this creates a closed, self-reinforcing feedback loop that financially and critically rewards immense technical spectacle and smooth gameplay loops over any kind of thematic depth or risk-taking.
And that tightly sealed feedback loop generates very predictable structural outcomes regarding the stories games actually tell.
Because these games operate in what the brilliant independent game designer Jonathan Blow calls an animal reaction mode.
Meaning the systems are designed to constantly trigger your fight or flight reflexes to keep you engaged.
Exactly. And because of that, they suffer from a specific industry-wide narrative pathology. Bloater terms this pathology, importance gigantism.
Okay, let's explore importance gigantism, because once you hear this concept, you see it in almost every blockbuster game. Because the core mechanics of these games involve extreme, repetitive actions. You're asking a player to shoot hundreds of bad guys, collect thousands of items, clear out dozens of enemy camps. The narrative needs to justify that level of extreme behavior.
So they constantly feel the need to raise the narrative stakes to the absolute absurd maximum.
You aren't just a detective solving a local murder. You are the chosen one who has to save the entire galaxy. You have to stop the literal apocalypse. And you do this game after game after game.
The irony is that by maximizing the stakes, they completely obliterate the emotional resonance. The outcome of this systemic need for massive apocalyptic stakes is that it presents scenarios that are fundamentally fake, arbitrary, and careless.
You save the world repeatedly, but you feel absolutely nothing.
The systemic consequences are completely hollow because the narrative is just a flimsy, high-gloss wrapper placed over a mechanical loop of shooting, looting, and leveling up.
Which brings us to a massive, imposing moral wall that the industry hits when dealing with high-fidelity interactivity. The source highlights the work of a designer named Clint Hawking, specifically his work on a brutal, fascinating game called Far Cry 2.
Now, Hawking is a designer who despises the framed narrative. He hates traditional cutscenes. He doesn't want to pause the game to tell you a story.
Right, he wants purely systemic, emergent events. He wants the player to be walking through the African jungle, fire a stray bullet, accidentally hit a propane tank, watch that tank go flying unpredictably into a dry tree, explode, and spark a massive, completely unscripted, dynamic wildfire.
A fire that spreads based on the game's wind simulation system, entirely changing the tactical landscape of the battle.
It is a beautiful, chaotic vision of pure interactive design. It is the holy grail for a certain type of systems engineer.
But here is the structural compromise they are forced to make. When designers build highly realistic, beautifully rendered, physics-based interactive systems that are entirely focused on combat, they hit that moral wall.
If a game simulates real-world violence with perfect visual fidelity, ballistic physics, and localized damage models, allowing a player to inflict that highly realistic violence on innocent, non-combatant civilians becomes profoundly, uncomfortably horrifying.
The graphics and physics engines have gotten so good that shooting a simulated civilian in these games wouldn't feel like a game anymore. It would feel genuinely traumatic.
So what does this all mean? How does this system handle this problem? How do they give you the tools of war without the trauma of war?
They simply erase the victims.
The system purposefully omits civilians from its worlds. In Far Cry 2, a game explicitly about a brutal, chaotic civil war in an African nation, there are virtually no refugees. There are no innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire. There are no children.
Everyone you meet in that massive open world is a heavily armed mercenary actively trying to kill you.
The system completely dodges its social and moral responsibility in order to remain a viable, palatable commercial product. But by doing so, it structurally prevents the player from ever experiencing the true, heavy moral consequences of their violent actions within that sandbox.
You are given a beautifully rendered, highly complex playground of violence, but you are artificially sheltered from the actual human cost of it.
And this sheltering, this tightly controlled, consequence-free feedback loop of action, violent execution, and immediate systemic reward leads directly into the darkest structural parallel we have to examine today. We have to look at the overlap between game design and addictive reinforcement systems.
The source material does not shy away from this at all. It leans right into it. At one point, the author explicitly compares the psychological experience of playing a massive game like Grand Theft Auto V to doing cocaine.
Yeah, that part of the book is intensely raw and confessional. It really caught me off guard. He notes that both the game system and the chemical drug system feed heavily on human impulsiveness. They both reinforce a deep, isolating sense of solitude.
And they both brilliantly, ruthlessly manipulate the brain's neurochemistry into chasing just one more mission, just one more level. Just let me clear this one last icon off the map.
He talks about a period in his life where he was living in Rome, going through a severe, crippling bout of depression. And during that time, he didn't turn to literature or film. He turned to a massive fantasy role-playing game called Oblivion.
He spent over 200 hours hiding inside that game.
And he describes the game as acting as an aspartame form of religion.
Aspartame form of religion is such a brilliant, devastating synthesis of what these systems provide. Think about what a massive open-world game like Oblivion actually is. It offers a convincing illusion of endlessness.
Right. If your real life in Rome is defined by depression, where everything feels chaotic, your dishes are piling up, you lack motivation, and nothing seems to matter, Oblivion provides the exact opposite.
It is an incredibly structured, perfectly logical environment where every single action is quantified, rewarded, and recognized by the system.
You pick a flower, your alchemy skill increases with a satisfying chime. You swing a sword, your strength goes up. You help a villager, you get gold, and a tangible sense of gratitude.
It rewards exploration and effort with constant, perfectly measured dopamine hits. It creates a digital sanctuary where the player can feel entirely competent, powerful, and purposeful, which is incredibly seductive and highly addictive when the real world feels overwhelmingly broken.
It's a mechanism for coping, but it's a mechanism built by a corporation designed to keep you logged in. But here is the paradox of this medium and why it is so endlessly fascinating as an art form. The system is capable of transcending that purely addictive mechanical loop.
It can occasionally break its own rules to create something profound.
The author describes a very specific moment in Grand Theft Auto IV. You are playing as Nico Bellic, an immigrant protagonist with a very dark, violent past. You reach a point late in the story where you, the player, have to make a genuinely heavy, morally compromising choice about who lives and who dies.
Up until this point, the game has been a chaotic, sensory overload sandbox of high-speed chases, explosions, and blaring, hilarious radio stations.
But after you make this grim choice, you get back into your car to drive away, and Nico reaches over and turns off the radio, and he just drives in complete, unbroken silence.
That is a profound moment of emotional alteration, and it only works because of the interactivity. The game purposefully uses the absence of its usual sensory bombardment to force the player to sit with the weight of the action they just took.
The system briefly breaks its own commercial, dopamine-driven loop of constant stimulation to deliver a moment of genuine emotional weight.
And the reason it hits so hard is that you aren't watching a movie character make a bad choice. You were the one who pulled the trigger. It proves that the medium possesses a terrifying potential to make us feel complex emotions, guilt, regret, complicity, precisely because we are complicit in the systems we are navigating.
So this brings up a huge question. If the narrative in these games is often hollow due to importance, gigantism, and the friction between the artistic ambition and the commercial reality is so intense, and the systems can be predatory and addictive, why does the system persist?
Why does it completely dominate our modern cultural landscape?
This source gives a few reasons. One is generational. The current titans of the industry, the people greenlighting these $100 million projects, are, as one editor in the source puts it, using their childhoods to create a business.
They're strip mining their own nostalgia.
They grew up in the 80s playing simple 8-bit games about space marines and dragons, and now they have hundreds of millions of dollars of corporate backing to recreate those exact same childhood fantasies in breathtaking, high-definition photorealism.
But childhood nostalgia is an exhaustible, natural resource. You can only remake the games of your youth so many times before the audience gets bored. The system persists not just because of the creator's nostalgia, but because of the psychological desires of the consumers. There is what we can call a dyadic surrender happening here.
I love that phrase, but we need to break it down. What exactly does a dyadic surrender look like for a player sitting on their couch?
It means it's a two-way street. It is a uniquely reciprocal relationship. Players actually want to be manipulated by the system, but on their own terms. We crave the narrative whip.
The narrative whip.
We want the comforting, hovering presence of an author to give our actions meaning and structure. We want to know there's a goal, a story, a reason for being there. But we simultaneously demand the ultimate agency to execute those actions ourselves.
We surrender to the rules of the game, but we demand the illusion of control. We want the absolute freedom of playing in a sandbox, but we want the comforting boundaries and curated experiences of a structured theme park.
It is a psychological tightrope walk that no other medium can offer.
And the system maintains its massive stability by finding a way to outsource its artistic risk. Because the AAA publishers are too terrified to innovate with $50 million on the line, the ecosystem relies on smaller, nested subsystems to absorb that risk.
Enter the indie game scene.
While massive publishers like EA and Activision are bleeding money chasing perfect water physics and photorealistic facial animations for their military shooters, independent creators with tiny budgets are acting as the industry's experimental pressure valve.
They are the ones actually pushing the medium forward.
They are essential to the ecosystem's survival. We look at creators like Jonathan Blow, who we mentioned earlier, who made a landmark indie game called Braid, or studios like That Game Company, which made a beautifully abstract game called Flower.
These developers are working with minimal budgets. They don't have the money for cinematic cutscenes, celebrity voice actors, or photorealistic graphics. Because they lack those resources, they are forced to create profound meaning directly through the mechanics of the game itself. They merge the ludonarrative and the framed narrative.
Let's really dig into Braid because it perfectly illustrates this fusion of mechanics and meaning. If you just look at a screenshot of Braid, it looks almost exactly like Super Mario Bros. It's a 2D platformer. You run to the right, you jump over pits, you jump on the heads of little enemies, and you are trying to rescue a princess.
But the core mechanic of the game, the system you're manipulating, is that you can rewind time whenever you want.
If you miss a jump and fall into a pit, you don't die and start over. You just hold a button, the music plays backwards, and you reverse time to try again. The entire theme of the game, which, without spoiling the brilliant ending, deals incredibly heavily with the concepts of time, deep regret, obsession, and the tragic human inability to undo past trauma, is woven directly into the mathematical rules of the platforming.
And in doing so, it brilliantly subverts the normalized, Pavlovian expectation cycles we have been trained to accept by decades of gaming. Think about the baseline we all understand. In Super Mario Bros., when you perfectly time a jump and land on a Goomba's head, the game gives you a happy little boing sound, a burst of visual points, and a feeling of triumph. You did a good job.
In Braid, when you jump on an enemy, it makes a sad, discordant, disappointed booing sound.
It genuinely makes you feel bad for doing the thing the genre told you to do.
Exactly. The game introduces the concept of doubt, hesitation, and moral consequence into a genre that has historically been defined by mindless, reflex-driven reward loops.
It uses the language of gameplay, the actual mechanics of jumping and interacting, to critique the player's actions and explore a deeply mature theme. It proves that the mechanics themselves can be the art.
That is so brilliant. It takes the established grammar of fun, the language we all learned as kids, and turns it into a grammar of reflection. It shows what the medium is capable of when it isn't paralyzed by the fear of losing millions of dollars. Which brings us ultimately to the most crucial part of this deep dive. How do we pull all of these systemic threads together? How does understanding the architecture of video games help us understand the broader world we live in today?
We have to reconnect this interactive entertainment system to the larger nested systems it currently inhabits and influences. The mechanisms that were pioneered, tested, and perfected in the crucible of video game design, the frictionless grammar of fun, the relentless iterative usability testing, the carefully calibrated dopamine drips of leveling up, the illusion of endlessness, the psychological hooks of the animal reaction mode, these are not contained just to consoles anymore.
These are the exact same systems, the exact same psychological levers that have been aggressively exported to shape the broader attention economy, digital capitalism, gig work applications, and the scrolling algorithms of every major social media platform.
And that leads us to the fundamental question.
Right. What is the crisis in perception here?
The crisis is that we fundamentally misperceive video games by forcing them into a rigid, false binary. We either dismiss them entirely as trivial, childish distractions, mere toys that aren't worth serious cultural analysis, or, conversely, we demand that they be pure, unimpeachable art objects, and we try to judge them by the exact same metrics we use for linear films or novels.
And what this false binary completely obscures is the underlying structural layer we've been unpacking today.
It blinds us to the massive, highly calibrated, incredibly risk-averse incentive architecture that is simultaneously shaping both transcendent, boundary-pushing artistic moments and predatory, addictive engagement loops.
When we get bogged down in the surface level culture war framing, wasting time arguing over are games art or do they cause real world violence, we fail analytically because we are only looking at the content. We are arguing about the paint colors on the walls of a casino rather than examining the blueprints of the casino itself to understand how the exits have been hidden and the oxygen is being pumped in.
By applying a systems-level analysis, our visibility completely changes. We stop judging this medium by the old, outdated standards of a linear novel or a passive film. We begin to recognize it for what it truly is, an unprecedented, wildly powerful hybrid engine.
It is a system where you, the player, are simultaneously a paying consumer and a vital co-author of the experience. You are navigating an environment that has been relentlessly scientifically optimized for your commercial retention and behavioral manipulation, yet is still, at its core, desperately yearning for cultural legitimacy and moments of genuine human connection.
It is a structure of immense contradiction. But its influence on how we interact with all digital systems is absolute. It is the architectural blueprint for the digital age.
Here's a final thought I want to leave you with, something to mull over on your own after this deep dive ends. If this grammar of fun, the systematic elimination of friction, and the carefully tuned dopamine loops in video games are explicitly designed to keep us engaged, isolated, and clicking buttons for hundreds of hours, what happens when those exact same design philosophies are fully applied to our civic, political, and social systems? When reality itself becomes gamified to optimize our animal reaction mode, who is holding the controller?
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.